Marshall's hands shook in anticipation as he slowly tore the wrapping paper. His heart was racing in his chest. He'd put this moment off for 50 years, but the time had come to face reality. The gift was a painful reminder of the woman he once loved, the one he promised to spend the rest of his life with. But as he pulled the final piece of wrapping paper from the box, his heart sank. How could she have done something like this? The present had been left in the shed for decades, and Marshall never planned on getting it out. It held a painful memory that he was better off forgetting about. But when his second wife, Angela, found the neatly wrapped gift in the shed, she had to know what was inside. "I feel like you're holding on to a part of her by not opening it. It's like it's not finished yet," she told Marshall. He'd never thought of it like that. To be honest, he'd forgotten that the gift even existed until she brought it into their home. In the months after Angela found the gift, she would not stop talking about it. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and click the notification bell for more amazing stories. I just think you should get it out of the way. "I feel like you're holding on to her by leaving the gift unopened," she spoke to her husband honestly. Although he never wanted to open the gift, he could tell that its existence made Angela uncomfortable. The day he decided to open the gift, he did it for his wife. The present was a harsh reminder of the life he spent with the woman before her. It wasn't fair on Angela, and he had to do something about it. The gift was wrapped in colorful paper with the words, "To my one true love," written neatly on top. Marshall's heart ached at the memory. Angela sat beside her husband like a supportive wife, rubbing a comforting hand over his tense shoulders. "I can't do it," he admitted, tears burning behind his eyes. Everything he had bottled up for all those years was coming to light. Angela was no fool. She could see the pain that burned behind his bright blue eyes. His previous wife had destroyed him. She wanted to help him. "You don't have to do it," she told the man she loved as she stared into his eyes. He rubbed a hand across his face, unsure of what to do next. "If you want, I can open it for you," she said lovingly. Marshall thought about it for a moment. The thought of seeing what was inside of the wrapping paper frightened him. "No, I have to do this myself," he stated. Angela squeezed her husband's hand before reaching for the present. It was rather heavy. For months, she wondered what his ex-wife had hidden behind the wrapping paper. But she was about to find out. As soon as she passed it to Marshall, he slowly began tearing the paper, revealing someone black underneath. But as he pulled the paper off, his heart dropped. He couldn't believe what he was looking at. Born and raised in New Jersey, Marshall Young had always considered himself a hopeless romantic. When he met his first wife, Sarah, he thought they would be together for the rest of their lives. She was beautiful and intelligent. Marshall wanted nothing more than to grow old with her. He thought they would have children and grandchildren, but he was wrong. As soon as they were married, Marshall realized that he had made a huge mistake. Sarah finally began showing her true colors, and he was mortified to find that she was a shallow, materialistic woman who only cared about herself. This realization broke Marshall's heart, but he couldn't imagine leaving her. They'd made a promise to stay together forever, but little did he know that she would break that promise just 4 years later. Marshall would never forget the day he walked into their bedroom and found the present sitting atop their bed. Beside it was a note that broke Marshall's heart into smithereens. Sarah was leaving him, and she had left him a present. That night, Marshall was a wreck. The last thing he wanted to do was open the present. So instead, he hid it in the shed and tried to forget about it. He was single for 3 years after that. The divorce had taken a massive toll on him. He loved Sarah for nearly a decade, only to learn that she was not the woman he thought she was. Marshall swore to himself that he would never get married again. But that all changed when he met Angela at a mutual friend's dinner party. How could he resist falling head over heels for her? Their relationship was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Angela was kind and soft, and didn't care about any of the materialistic things Sarah cared so much about. The day Marshall married Angela was the happiest day of his life. After years of swearing he would never marry again, he'd found a woman that was worth it. But decades later, Angela made a troubling discovery. Angela and Marshall were in their 70s when she stumbled upon the wrapped gift in their shed. At first, she was beyond confused, but as she turned it over, she spotted the tiny, weathered name tag. "From Sarah," she read aloud. She could tell that the present had been sitting in that spot for decades. But why hadn't Marshall opened it, and what was inside? Angela grabbed the present and left the shed. When she walked into their home, Marshall was in the kitchen, preparing a pot of tea. It had become a tradition to share a pot of tea around noon. Marshall could hear his wife's footsteps behind him. When he turned to face her, he was taken aback by the present in her hand. His heart sank into the pit of his stomach. The second Marshall turned to face Angela, she could see the distress on his face. His mind was flooded with a million thoughts a second as he stared at the old present. He couldn't believe the wrapping paper had survived decades in the shed. "What is this?" Angela questioned, as her husband's face twisted in sadness. But she had no idea how bad it truly was. "It's a present," Marshall said sternly. He didn't want to have to deal with this right now. But Angela was persistent. She wanted to know why her husband had an unopened gift from his ex-wife. She pressed him for an answer, and eventually he gave her one. "Sarah left it on our bed the day she left me. I put it in the shed because it kept reminding me of her and how awful I felt after the divorce," he said honestly. Angela stared sadly at the man she loved. He was becoming emotional just seeing the gift. He had never been the best at processing emotions. He'd always bottled them up, and now those terrible feelings were resurfacing. "Please, honey, can you put it back in the shed? I can't look at that," he blinked back tears. But Angela had to know what was inside the box. However, she would never go against her husband's wishes. She placed the gift where she had found it, but from that day on, she noticed a change in the man she loved. Marshall had become distant. She often found him staring into space, lost in his thoughts. She knew it had to do with Sarah and the way she had treated him. But was there more to it? She tried to speak to her husband about it now and then, but he always seemed to bottle up. She knew Sarah was a touchy subject, and he was dealing with intense trauma from his previous marriage. But Angel wished her husband would open up to her about how he felt. But as the months passed, he became more distant with every passing day. Angela couldn't help but feel like it was all her fault. It felt like she had caused her husband grief by taking the gift out of the shed. But how could she have known what the story behind it was? Marshall had been depressed for months, and she had thought of every possible way to help him. But one night, something truly disturbing happened. That night, Angela was alone in the kitchen, preparing dinner for herself and her husband. Usually, they would prepare dinner together. Angela sighed to herself. She missed the days when Marshall used to be himself. He would float around the kitchen, making conversation. But everything was different now. She had no idea where her husband was. He had left the house early that day, and as far as she was concerned, he hadn't returned. But then, she heard something. The strange creaking sound from outside caught her attention immediately. At first, she assumed it had come from the neighbor's yard. She went about her time chopping tomatoes and peeling potatoes. But a few minutes later, she heard the strange sound again. She paused for a moment and placed the knife down. The room fell silent as she tried to listen. Then, she heard something horrifying. The The sound of a man grunting sent a chill down her spine. That was when it became obvious. The sounds were coming from their yard. Angela's blood went cold. Recently, she'd heard of many attempted robberies in the area. Without Marshall home, she was terrified. She decided to do the first thing that came to mind. Angela decided to drop to the ground and slowly crawl toward the kitchen entrance. But she wasn't ready for what would happen. Angela's heart was pounding as she crawled out of her kitchen and into the living room. She could hear someone right outside the back door. She made her way toward the back window, desperate to see what on earth was going on in their backyard. Slowly, she pulled herself up from the floor and peeked through the window. But what she saw through that window made her gasp. She was beyond surprised to find the shed door cracked open. The light was on, but she couldn't see anyone inside. Was it possible that she had left the door open and the light on the last time she was in there? She wasn't sure. But then, she saw something. Angela remained close to the floor as she peeked into the open crack of the door. It was then that she saw a dark figure moving around inside of it. For a moment, she thought to call for her husband, but then she remembered that he had left. But who on earth would be snooping around in there? It was completely dark out at that point. Over the years, they had kept many valuables in the shed. Had someone come to steal them? Although Angela was terrified, she couldn't allow that to happen. Whoever had come onto her property had crossed the line, and she had to stop them. Her heart was beating furiously as she crawled away from the window and stood up from the cold floor. She had to stop them. But first, she needed something that she could use as protection. Angela quickly dashed up the stairs and toward their bedroom. Grabbing the pepper spray from the top drawer of her dresser, she just hoped she wouldn't have to use it. But she was in for a big surprise. Angela had never been the most brave woman. For all her life, she feared this moment. An intruder was on her property, and she was all alone. As she quietly walked downstairs, she could still hear the terrible sounds from outside. It sounded like the person was digging through their things. She considered calling Marshall, but there was no time. She had to go out there. But was it worth risking something terrible? When Angela stepped up to the front door, she slowly unlocked it, hoping no one could hear that she was leaving the house. Her plan was simple. She was going to leave through the front door, then quietly walk around to the back of the house. Then she would approach the shed. She just hoped that the person would run away as soon as they saw her. But sadly for Angela, things would not go according to plan. Quietly, the woman left her house and walked along it, heading straight for the shed in the back. The sounds were even louder outside. With each small step, Angela was growing closer to the shed. Before she knew it, she was standing right outside. The sounds were obnoxious. Whoever was in there was throwing stuff around and scraping heavy objects across the floor. That could only mean one thing. The person was obviously strong enough to move the heavy boxes around, which meant it must have been a man. Angela's face flushed. It was now or never. She tried not to think of the consequences as she held the pepper spray and stepped closer to the door. Her hands were shaking and her knees were growing weak below her. Finally, she peeked through the crack and saw the man. At first, Angela couldn't make out any of his features. The man had his back turned toward her as he dug through a large box. Angela placed a terribly shaky hand against the wooden door and slowly pushed it open. Her heart dropped. She wished her husband had been around to help her, but as she pushed the door open, it made the terrible creaking sound she'd heard from the house. Angela winced when the sound echoed through the small shed. The man went still, realizing that someone was standing right behind him. She panicked, grabbing her pepper spray tightly. She held it out in front of her. "Hey, you, get out of here, or I will use this pepper spray on you," she warned. Angela's voice was shaking, as were her hands. The man slowly raised his hands above his head and slowly turned around. The second she saw her husband's face, relief washed over her. "Oh, thank goodness." She cheered and pulled her husband in for a hug. "I thought someone was breaking in. Where have you been all day?" she questioned, but she was not ready for his response. "I just needed some time to myself," he said in a sad voice. When Angela looked behind him, she noticed something strange. Marshall had been reorganizing the shed, and when she looked behind him, she saw the gift. It was buried beneath other boxes. It was like Marshall was trying to hide it in an effort to get it out of his mind. When they went back into the house, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The gift had caused so much grief for her husband, and it was time to rip the Band-Aid off. She decided to act the following morning. That morning, Angela left the house early and made her way toward the shed. The present was right where she had left it. Angela quickly grabbed it and went inside. Marshall was in the lounge, reading a book. As soon as he spotted the gift in her hands, he grew nervous. "What are you doing with that?" he questioned. Angela sat down beside her husband, a look of sympathy on her face. She had a suggestion, and she wasn't sure how he was going to take it. He waited patiently for her to speak. "I want you to do something for me," she started, and placed the present on the table before him. "You are holding on to something from 5 decades ago, and I think that by opening this gift, you'll finally be able to move on from that life," she said. Marshall stared at his wife for a second, admiring the care and love in her eyes. It was something he had never seen in another woman before. He knew that what she was saying was true. "But I don't want to force you to do anything you don't want to. You don't have to open it, but I think it would be for the best," she reassured him. He stared at her for a moment, and then the corners of his mouth pulled into a small, sad smile. "I have been avoiding this for 50 years, and every time I've thought of it, it's caused me pain. I think it's time to see what's inside," he said. Tears burned behind Angela's eyes as she looked at the man she loved most in the world. Finally, his mind would be put to ease. She sat beside him supportively, her hand rubbing slow, comforting circles into his tense shoulders. He thought for a second, his eyes focused on the present. "I can't do it," he admitted, tears burning behind his eyes. Everything he had bottled up for all those years was coming to light. Angela could see how distressed he was. She decided to remind him of what she had said earlier. "Remember, you don't have to do it if you don't want to," she spoke delicately. He rubbed a hand across his face. He was unsure of himself. "If you want, I can open it for you," she said lovingly. Marshall thought about it for a moment. The thought of seeing what was inside of the wrapping paper frightened him. "No, I have to do this myself," he stated. He braced himself for what he was about to unwrap. However, the more he thought about it, the more hesitant he became. Why did he have to bring up old memories by opening this long-forgotten gift? What purpose would it serve him now? He was happy and married to a great woman. Opening this gift would do absolutely nothing for him. At this point in his life, the gift meant zero to him. Marshall sat with the gift in his hand, contemplating whether he should open it or not. Angela was staring at him in anticipation. "Well, are you going to open it? You have me waiting on tenterhooks here, Marshall." His wife was more intrigued than he was. If anything, he would open it just to appease her. Angela could see that her husband was having a hard time. "Talk to me, Marshall. What's eating you?" His wife was always very supportive. But the real reason why he didn't want to open the gift was because he wanted to spare her any heartache the contents of the gift might bring. He didn't know what to expect. "I don't know, Angela. My ex-wife was a very different woman from who you are, and I don't know what could be in this package. I don't want you to feel a certain way about this stupid gift." Angela giggled. She knew what her husband was thinking. "So you think I'll be jealous of what might be wrapped up in this gift?" Marshall nodded. He didn't want this silly, decades-old gift to cause a rift between them. It would be the last thing that he wanted. "Don't worry, dear. I'm long past being jealous about anything. I just want you to have closure. So come on, let's open this thing and get it over with once and for all." Angela squeezed his hand lovingly and reached for the gift. For months, she had wondered what his ex-wife had hidden behind the wrapping paper. But she was about to find out. As soon as she placed it in Marshall's hand, he slowly began tearing the paper, revealing someone black underneath. But as he pulled the paper off, his heart dropped. He couldn't believe what he was looking at. He slowly lifted the black book from the paper and stared at the cover. It was an old photo album, but when he opened it, there was a note on the first page. "To my dear Marshall, always remember me at my most beautiful," Sarah had written in black pen. But as he paged through the photo album, he was disgusted by what was inside. It was all photos of Sarah. Many of them were professionally taken by photographers. Angela couldn't believe what she was looking at as she sat beside her husband. There wasn't a single photo of Marshall or his family. It was all about Sarah, just like their marriage was. Marshall was instantly reminded of how vain and materialistic she was. He pulled a face, disgusted by the gift. As Marshall paged through the rest of the album, he came across some other photos. But not the loving memories Marshall had expected. Instead, it was a collection of scandalous photographs that Sarah had taken during their marriage. Each image seemed to mock the idea of their once happy life together. Angela gasped as she caught a glimpse of the contents. The shock on her face mirrored the disbelief in Marshall's eyes. The realization that his ex-wife had left behind a time capsule of deceit and betrayal hit him like a tidal wave. Angela reached out to comfort Marshall, her hand resting on his trembling shoulder. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence as the weight of the shocking revelation hung in the air. It was not the closure Marshall had expected, but it was closure nonetheless. Tears welled up in his eyes, not out of sadness for what was lost, but out of relief that he had finally faced the truth. The woman he once loved had deceived him, and the painful memories he had held onto for decades had been laid bare. As Angela embraced him, Marshall felt a mix of emotions: pain, relief, and gratitude. Grateful for Angela's unwavering support and understanding, the burden that had haunted him for years began to lift. Together, they decided to burn the photo album, symbolizing the end of that chapter in Marshall's life. The flames flickered and danced, consuming the deceitful images and freeing Marshall from the chains of his past. In the aftermath, Angela and Marshall faced the challenge of rebuilding the trust that had been shaken by the unexpected discovery. They sought solace in each other, realizing that the strength of their love could overcome the scars of the past. The ashes of the photo album served as a metaphor for the cleansing of old wounds. The couple, now bound by a deeper understanding, embarked on a new journey, leaving behind the shadows that had lingered for far too long. As time passed, the painful memories faded, replaced by the warmth of a love that had weathered a storm. Angela knew that their relationship could face anything. Angela and Marshall's bond grew stronger, forged through the fire of truth and acceptance. The gift that had once been a source of dread became a catalyst for healing and renewal. Marshall couldn't believe that he had spent years focusing on a woman who couldn't have cared less about him. She had always only cared about herself. Marshall burst out laughing as he thought about the album. "What a useless gift," he told Angela, who had begun laughing too. They knew that they had made the right decision by burning the album. Marshall was instantly cured of the guilt he had always felt about his first marriage. He deserved better than Sarah. He deserved Angela. With laughter echoing through the room, Angela and Marshall found a newfound lightness in their hearts. The weight of the past had lifted, leaving them free to focus on the joy and love they shared in the present. As they cleaned up the remnants of the burnt album, Marshall couldn't help but feel a sense of liberation. The shackles of his past had been broken, and he was ready to embrace the happiness that had eluded him for too long. Together, Angela and Marshall decided to use the experience as a stepping stone towards a brighter future. They began creating new memories, cherishing the moments they spent together. The scars of the past were gradually replaced by the beauty of the life they were building. Nothing else mattered to them. All they cared about were each other and not the shadows of the past. Years passed, and Angela and Marshall celebrated milestone after milestone together. Their love endured, and they grew old gracefully, surrounded by the warmth of a relationship that had weathered the test of time. In the quiet moments, they would glance at each other, sharing a silent understanding that spoke volumes about the strength of their bond. Past was a distant echo, and the present held the promise of a love that had only deepened with the passing years. In the end, what remained was not the painful memories of a failed marriage, but the legacy of a love that had triumphed over adversity. Angela and Marshall became an inspiration for those around them, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. They became role models for their children and grandchildren, who wanted their relationships to last as long as theirs had. The unopened gift that once symbolized heartbreak and regret had transformed into a symbol of resilience and the power of love. It served as a reminder that sometimes, in order to move forward, one must confront the ghosts of the past and find the strength to let go. And so, Angela and Marshall continued their journey together, hand in hand, leaving behind the shadows of yesterday and embracing the boundless possibilities of tomorrow. Binding bonds through beautiful tales. Thank you for watching.